All right, welcome back, y'all. This is going to be Unit 5. No, Unit 7. Unit 7, Chapter 26, Disagreement and Alternative Dispute Resolution in the Policy Process by Boyd Fuller. We'll jump right into the intro. The chapter focuses on dispute resolution paradigms and practices. This is excellent stuff. If you want to go to law or you want to do sort of NGO work, this can even work in your family and your work atmosphere, right? Like this dispute resolution stuff is very powerful. And this is a chapter you should really try to focus in on. It's based on the works of negotiation theory from Harvard Negotiation Project. And the basic premise here is that parties, the underlying assumption of the negotiation theory is that parties mask their positions and their interests, and that an effective negotiator has to sort of uncover the interests of each side, right? And it may be difficult to get stakeholders to participate until they're convinced that the venue they're in and the debate they're in, or whatever, um, if they can't get a better outcome there than they can somewhere else, then they're going to go somewhere else, right? And this is, let me find it. I think it's called like BAMFA or, um, shit. We'll get there. I should have put that up in the beginning. All right, 26.2. Negotiation theory is a starting point. So there are 7 basic elements from the Harvard Negotiation Project. Again, if you plan on at all doing law or mediation or high-level NGO work, that kind of stuff, you should really sort of look into this Harvard Negotiation Project. It focuses on the barriers, the strategies, and the tools relevant to individual parties and negotiations. And basically, what we're doing is we're looking for win sets, right? The mediator or the negotiator is looking for win sets that increase all the parties' payoffs relative to not cooperating, right? So some sort of synergy. Um, and maybe we can all get a winning outcome if we collaborate in some way, right? Okay, they say interests and positions are very distinct, right? The interests are the wants and needs that motivate the negotiators or their positions, right? So this is what we talked about in sort of the decision-making stuff, right? This is going to be your heuristics. This is going to be your goals. This is going to be your ideological or religious perspective, whatever it might be. The positions are the stated wants and the solutions that the parties seek to get the others to accept, right? And so your positions are built upon your interests, but they are distinct. Okay, the third sort of piece of the or element of the Harvard Negotiation Project is agreements, right? And we have some necessary conditions for possible agreement sets, right? They have to be beneficial to the self, right, or to the coalition or whatever that's negotiating, or all coalitions that are negotiating. It has to meet the interests of the counterparts in the negotiation, right? So this means that many alternatives should not or cannot be considered, right? And this gets a lot more complicated the more actors you have involved or the more coalitions you have involved, right? If it's not just a 1 versus 1, but now it's a 6 versus 6 free for all, right? It becomes very complicated. I would say, like from a data perspective, we should build ordinal lists, right? Ordinal means in data talk that it's a from best to worst, but there's no numerical equivalence between each category, right? So it's not like category 1 is quote unquote 1 better than category 2, which is 1 better than category 3, right? It's not a measurement, it's just a listing of order, right? And it's not nominal because nominal is the other setup, right? Where it's just a bunch of names categorized, right? It's not that. There is an order to it, but it's not like dollars or kilowatt hours or whatever the hell it might be, right? Where you actually have a measurement between categories. They're just ordered. Okay, so interests can be laid out in an ordinal, most preferred way, right? Where pieces of one party's list of goals or outcomes on their ordinal list can be traded off against another party who has them maybe lower on the list and wants something else, right? So if party one has three listed, right, in order, and party two has three listed, maybe we can trade off their least interested one against their best and their least against their best, right? And so, as an excellent practice as a negotiator, a mediator, to get the parties involved or the actors to fill out ordinal lists of what they would like to accomplish can really help you when it comes later, when it comes to the sort of the bargaining process, right? Okay. Alternatives. In this sense, the alternatives are outcomes you can get outside of this debate space, right? And so if the alternatives are better, um, one party or more parties will just walk away, right? So not only do you have to sort of negotiate lists, but you also have to ensure that the potential outcomes are going to be greater than in some other realm, right? All right. Number four, we need objective criteria. This means external standards that parties agree to as the basis for a decision about how values will be divided between them. And this becomes a very important piece later once an agreement has been reached and implemented in monitoring um, effectiveness and monitoring things like cheating on the agreement, right? And so we have to come to an agreement before we even ever really start to debate about what kind of information are we going to use. Can we agree that that information is quote unquote clean across different groups that are debating, all of these sorts of things. And we've learned in this course that information is difficult, right? People will see the same data set in very different ways. People will prioritize certain research institutions over others, right? If you're conservative, you're probably leaning toward like the American Heritage Foundation. Um, and so this can be important, right? Establishing what information we can all agree upon. Okay, the fifth element is commitment. This is the connection between the negotiators and the constituencies that they represent, but also the institutions of government and the public. And we need to know what authorization exists to even implement an agreement. If we get a bunch of, say, oil executives in a room and we can agree to a new law or whatever it might be, is that even going to pass, right? God damn, my camera sucks. Is that even going to pass? Is it going to follow the rules of the institutions that already exist? You can't just come to an agreement and then say go implement it and it's illegal, right? So there are institutional constraints and boundaries by which we have to play the game. The sixth element in the Harvard Negotiation School is communication. What information is going to be shared? What information is going to be sought out? And how do we reveal that information either up front or maybe we let it trickle out over time? All of these sorts of things, right? And then their final piece is relationships, the connections between the parties and then the parties and the mediator. All right. Section 26.3. Why negotiations and disagreements in the policy process are more difficult, right? So they're saying, look, negotiating a divorce or negotiating a split between corporations or subsidiaries or whatever it might be is simpler than negotiating public policy, right? because of all of the institutional constraints, because of all of the veto players, because of how many people it's going to affect, all of these sorts of things. So, why is policy more difficult than other negotiation realms? First is complexity and scale, right? You have sequential, right, over time, but also simultaneous negotiations happening in multiple settings and multiple institutions across the entire planet, right? Um, and increasing complexity tends to lead toward coalition formation, right? So this is what they touched on in the advocacy coalition framework model. The more complex, the bigger it is, the more likely you're going to have to roll resources together with other like-minded groups, right? And so you'll get coalition formation, and then those coalitions will actually negotiate about public policy changes. This coalition creation, it allows for a lot of things. It allows for specializations, it allows for a bundling of resources, allows for greater representation, all of these sorts of things. But it also leads to internal negotiations about how are we going to approach this negotiation process? What information are we going to prioritize? Um, where do we stand ideologically and pragmatically? All of these sorts of things, right? So the negotiation just shifts internally, and they have to sort of resolve issues before they can ever come to the table. Okay, the second piece that makes policy more difficult is representation of complex and unorganized constituencies, right? So you have the principal agent problem here. It's really difficult to pin down large groups of people, right? You can't just say, like, say, Texans are Republican. Like that's not real, right? There's a lot of nuance there. And so it can be really hard to pin down large groups. We also have a lot of institutional rules, like windows for comment, right? Or pre existing laws that exist. Or sometimes at the state level, you'll have to have an amendment ballot passed by a majority of your citizenry. The courts can get involved. You have things like sunshine laws and public disclosure and FOIA acts, right? Which can all affect how much we can talk, how well we represent, all of these sorts of things. All right. The third difficulty of public policy is stakeholders' contested knowledge. We've hammered on this in this class, right? Knowledge is difficult sometimes, and people will disagree. But common knowledge is vital to problem definition, to options for solutions, to resolution outcomes, all of these sorts of things, right? And so we do need knowledge. We can't just poo-poo it and say like, oh, everybody has their own different beliefs and and ideas, so nothing can get done. That's not helpful, right? So we have to figure out how we can come to common conceptualizations of what knowledge is acceptable and what is not. Why does knowledge differ across different groups, right? We have different frameworks, we have different practices, we have different religious and ideological beliefs. Social science can be very difficult to pin down, right? In the quote unquote hard sciences like physics and chemistry, they're looking for a zeta equals 5, which is a 1 in 3.5 million chance that the outcome is random, right? In social science, we're usually looking for a 1.96 zeta or whatever it might be in a t-test, and this means that you have a 1 in 20 chance of the finding being random, right? 1 in 20, 5%, versus 1 in 3 million, far less than 1/10 of 1%, are very, very different thresholds for saying this is scientifically accurate, right? And social sciences threshold is way below the physical sciences. for a number of reasons, right? Part of it is just like this is the number we've all assumed from historical research going back 100 years. Part of it is that human behavior doesn't work like rocks, right? Or electrons, or whatever the hell it might be. Um, it's just a very different world of study, right? And so, yeah, social science can be hard to pin down, and this is why replication is so vitally important. Maybe even more so in social science than in the physical sciences, right? Some other reasons, data can be manipulated, right? And some researchers have been called out for this. A big case that I would point you to is the stuff on what is it called? The amyloid plaques in your brain and things like dementia, right? There were a lot of results that were fabricated, and it cost the government and it cost the world billions of dollars in research money thrown down the drain, um, years of scientists' lives who didn't know that these results were fabricated, trying to replicate them and not understanding why in the hell they can't replicate them. This can be very troubling, right? And those people like lost some of those people lost their jobs, got outed from the scientific community, all kinds of stuff, right? But it does happen. Experimental designs might be poor. This is a big problem in social science, in my personal opinion, is that experimental designs are pretty weak, right? Especially, from I don't know if you're not the very top social scientists in our field, like Bernadette Mosqueda or Adam Jaworski or Robert Putnam or whatever it might be, right? The sort of middling and lower level researchers, the experimental designs can be very bad. Um, and you get things like picking and choosing of variables, you get omitted variable bias. We know that some scientists have been caught sort of, they'll run a model, make it look really pretty, and then build a theory around their findings. This is called ad hoc theorizing. This is terrible, terrible science, right? And so we got to be careful about that sort of thing. We're also, at least in sort of the modern era, we're getting a just complete delegitimization of experts, um, and we're getting this platforming of alternative voices, right? Like, um, man, I don't know, Joe Rogan and Alex Jones talking about science and stuff like that. Like, that just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But the more that you delegitimize the experts and the scientists, the less room there is for everyone to agree that this is useful data or science or whatever it might be, right? We also know for a fact that this sort of thing not only has happened in the academic world, but also in courtrooms, right? We've had cigarettes and big tobacco. They built up their entire own research foundation to try and dispute findings about cancer and all the rest, right? We also know that big oil did this for, I don't know, since basically the early 70s, we've discovered big oil knew for a fact that like this was going to cause global climate change because of all of the CO2 being dumped into the air, and they hid it, right? And these documents came out later, and they sort of manipulated the data and made fake reports and all this kind of shit. So we know that this happens, right? And so it will inevitably happen when you are trying to do mediation or negotiation. You just have to be aware and careful of it, right? We also have strategic leaking of information, right? Or withholding of information, or lying, or manipulation, or reinterpretation of data, right? Politicians do it every day. Many corporations behave in this sort of way, and so I just think like it would be silly to assume that everyone is being open and honest about all of this stuff when you're in a negotiating setting, right? All right. The fourth difficulty that makes public policy harder is divergent values, frames, and belief systems, right? And so a lot of this, again, touches on our discussion of decision making, bounded rationality, heuristics, value frameworks, all of the rest, and more ties to the advocacy coalition network or framework, right? And then especially a whole bunch of stuff about like heuristics and belief systems. Um, there are a lot of issues here, right? There's language, and this can be a real frustration, right? Because different ideological sets, like Democrats and Republicans, use very different keywords, assumptive sort of frameworks, all kinds of stuff to talk within their own base, but also because like this is the way their base talks, right? And the other side can see it as misunderstood or openly provocative, right? And sometimes it can be intended to be provocative. I'm not even saying that like this is always just a misunderstanding, right? There's a lot of signaling to the base that goes on in this stuff. And so it can really cause each side to sort of shut down and say, you're just not listening, or you're, I don't know, a racist, or you're a communist, or whatever, whatever it might be, right? Um, and so language can be difficult. And so I would point out a couple, like, okay, say we're talking about wilderness spaces, right? And we're talking about national parks, and the left is going to be talking about pristine land and ecology and saving species and all of these sorts of things, while the right will be talking about economic growth and strategic resource management and mining and whatever it might be, right? And so, like, they can just talk completely past each other sometimes because even the goals are wildly different. Another one is like labor versus corporatism, right? When we're trying to figure out, like, I don't know, what is a minimum wage law going to be, or what are the safety laws around particular industries going to be, right? All of these sorts of things. And so the labor side and the unions are going to be talking about workers' rights and safety, et cetera, while the corporate boards and the big businesses are going to be talking about job creation and profitability and economic growth. And again, I mean, these things just go completely beyond each other. We also have problem framing, right? So consider something like agriculture where the left will tend to be saying, okay, we need less pesticidal and herbicidal runoff into our streams or our, I don't know, our topsoil or whatever it might be, right? And there are things like cancer concerns, etc. Well, the average farmer is probably saying, look, we need those pesticides, even if they cause cancer, because we can't just like always till the land. That's what led to the Dust Bowl, right? And that's the only other way of de-weeding, basically. And they're talking about agricultural output and profit margins and all of these sorts of things, right? And so just framing the problem can be incredibly difficult. We can also get just intractability. Again, they'll just talk past each other. What we know is that values and rights are far more intractable than something like economic gain or whatever it might be, right? And so when people start talking about their values, they'll tend to shut down far more often. This is also becoming a lot more difficult to write policy in at least the contemporaneous period because like every damn social ill that exists in our society now has become politicized, right? From, geez, I don't know, junk food to, I mean, all kinds of stuff. School boards, whatever, like everything touches on politics now. And it always did, but it's just becoming far more politicized in the modern era. And this makes it really difficult to get agreements made, right? Um, you also get sort of, social justice signaling from both sides. Like, I don't know, the right likes to say like, oh, the left just being social justice warriors, and the left is, you know, there's something to that, but the right does it too. Um, and so it's pretty disingenuous because on the other side, while the left may be trying to put in sort of overarching philosophical, secular sort of social justice signaling, right? The right's trying to do the same thing with religion and Christianity, and all of these sorts of things as well. So, this social justice signaling that like keeps coming and coming and coming, and cancel culture and all the rest, it's just making all of this so much more difficult. And I would say, especially when you're in a public discursive setting, or if you're in meetings that are bound to FOIA rules, right? Freedom of Information Act rules. Um, they're mowing the lawn. Ugh, it's annoying. I need a desk. Okay, so when you're with in a setting where FOIA is possible, then they're going to be a lot more careful with their words, right? And so sometimes secrecy can be helpful, right? That is a touchy situation as to, are we trying to hide things from the public and write policy without them? But also, there's space to be a little bit more open and honest about beliefs and goals and all that sort of stuff. Okay, my last point here is that if you yourself become sort of a mediator or a negotiator or whatever it might be, right? It is incumbent upon you to do your homework. Um, Read the biographies of all the people in the room, right? Learn what their ideas are, learn what their history is, read their op eds in newspapers, know your people, right? All of them, right? Even if you're sort of one of not the negotiator itself, but you're, say, an NGO leader, and you're trying to negotiate with other groups, right? It's good to know the people in the other groups. It's good to know the actors. Flatter them, right? Use what we know about psychology, and tie them up in their own words, right? Sometimes that can make space. All right. Section 26.4, consensus building and mediation theory, right? So we basically have another 5-step program. this this is sort of becoming a theme in this class, it seems like. But the first step is convene the parties, right? Like, obviously we're going to have to know who's there. And so this can include agenda setting. It can include identifying the key actors and institutions that are going to be in the negotiations. Um, and know that sometimes there are a handful of actors that basically have to be reached out to, right? So if we're talking about sort of labor or labor safety or whatever, like, obviously you're probably going to have to get in touch with some unions, right? With education policy, you're probably going to have to get with some unions, right? If you're talking about like banking policy, you're probably going to need to reach out to like Bank of America or Jamie Dimon at what is it, J.P. Morgan Chase. So know who the key actors are, because sometimes if you can't get those people on board, the entire thing will fall apart as being seen as delegitimate, right? Okay. The second piece, excuse me, not the second piece, still inside convening the parties, right? We have to assess the conflict. So generally, what you'll do is get a neutral third party expert or some mediator, or you yourself will be the mediator. You will identify and interview stakeholders and the leaders in their organizations. You will try to figure out what are their interests, what are their ideas for solutions, how willing are they to participate. You will need to do your homework and do background research on their organization and their actors and their leaders. And then I actually add here that you might want to, and this is touchy, and you will have to really think out how you're going to present this, but you might want to ask all of the participating organizations to build their own ordinal set of maybe 8 to 10 goals that they want, right? And put them in order. If you could get just one, what would it be, right? And then go all the way down to 8 to 10 or whatever. You can say, I will keep this personal, or and I will not release it to any of the parties, right? So that you can keep your negotiating space. Or we can have discussions in the future about how do maybe we leak a little bit of this on time, or at particularly tight moments of the negotiating process, or whatever, right? And this will allow you a lot of space to be able to play off lesser and greater goals against different groups, right? To maybe get some sort of synergistic outcome. Okay. You also have to disseminate information about the process. So, you're going to build a report on what you learned from all the different interviews and all this kind of stuff. You'll build rules around how the negotiation process is going to work and what behavior should look like and the time for talking and all kinds of shit, right? And this allows you to sort of frame the agenda and the potential solution sets as a negotiator before you ever get things off the ground, right? All right. Next, clarification of rules and responsibilities for the groups. Um, we need to define what are the institutional constraints here, what are the laws that already exist, um, what sort of, if we do get an agreement, what are we going to have to do to get it passed into public policy, all of these sorts of things. Um, Sometimes, like I was touching on earlier, private discussions can be very useful, at least intermittently, right? So maybe we'll have some open, and then we'll go back to private, and then we'll have open and private, blah, 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 right? It can be very useful, especially I do a lot of international ethnic conflict stuff. And so imagine you have two or more ethnic groups and their leaders trying to negotiate power within a state, or like what a state is going to look like if we're building new institutions or whatever. It could be insanely difficult to ask them to stand in a room against their sort of, I don't know, sometimes like opponent or racial opponent, right? In some of these senses, if we're in like a civil war or something, and to, um, with good faith, make arguments about how we can shut this down or improve things or whatever, right? Because people are watching. People are watching. And so you have to signal to your base in those situations. You you have to be very careful about what you say and how you frame it in those situations. Whereas in privacy, you have a lot more space to be open and honest and not have to send those signals to your base, right? Whether it be racial or religious or whatever it might be, ideological. Other times, privacy is appropriate, right? We're not trying to pass laws about corporate investment or, I don't know, maybe healthcare or these sorts of things without public involvement, right? And so you've got to find a nice balance and understand what is the context of negotiation that you are in and whether some of that stuff needs to be in a more private setting, or maybe you serve as the interlocutor between groups without them having to say things out loud, right? And what we're looking for here is, again, trade offs between these ordinal goals lists and synergy. We want win win sets, right? Or else they're going to leave under what we call BATNA conditions, which means the best alternative to negotiated agreements. All right. Three, These are the 5 steps of consensus building. Of consensus building. Number 3, deliberate to deliver options that seek to meet the needs of participating stakeholders and the public. So this is where we do a little bit of policy formulation. This is where we talk about different options of how we can approach things, all of these sorts of things, right? And here's where BATNA comes in. Again, this means the best alternative to negotiated agreements. If our negotiated agreement cannot rise above the outcome of BATNAs, then the whole thing will be scrapped, right? Okay. Number 4, make decisions that have the support of all or almost all the stakeholders. Here again, you'll do a little bit more rule setting. So what is the standard for determining a rule, right? For a negotiated agreement? Is it a majority of all the participants in a vote, like 50% plus one, right? Which not great, not great. You don't want to leave 49% on the side, right? Is it a supermajority, 66%, sometimes 75%, whatever it might be? Those tend to have higher levels of legitimacy and higher levels of higher likelihood of actually being implemented in the long run. You can have weighted decision making, right? And so the UN will do this sometimes, where if we're talking about something like developing the global south might get more weight to their vote than, say, someone in the global north, right? Something like that. We also do this in like opinion polling, right? Where we weight respondents to try to build a better data set, right? So we're looking for generally around 1,000 respondents in a good opinion poll. That'll lead to plus or minus 3 variation. The problem is trying to find, like, I don't know, the small subset of, say, Native American, or the small subset of, say, I don't know, people from like the Polynesia, Micronesia area, these sorts of things. Or say we're trying to include something from like the trans community, which is a remarkably small proportion of the overall population. Well, if we can find those individuals from those groups, we can sort of give them greater weight just because it's so difficult to find them out there. Um, and so this is the same idea within these sort of negotiated sets. Once a decision is made, then we have a big game that we got to play. We got to sort of either, I don't know, how do you want to call it, disseminate information or propagandize or whatever. You've got to tell the stakeholders, the citizens, the Congress, etc. This is why we came to this agreement. This is why this will be the best approach, etc. So that eventually you can actually implement these things in the real world. All right. The final stage of the 5 from consensus building is implement agreements and other commitments, right? So this sort of fits in with the implementation stage. It has to fit within existing institutional and legal frameworks mostly, right? There's some poking at borders and like, hey, take it to the courts and see what happens. But mostly you got to play within sort of the institutional constraints. Often these sort of tests, especially with new programs and policies or whatever, can be built out at a really small scale. Say we'll try a state or a city or a region to sort of test for improvements in feasibility, externalities, effectiveness, all of these sorts of things, right? And sometimes an agreement will be made, but there will be no actual authority, and then what happens is you basically drop off of the map and you become one of many groups that is trying to provide expert testimony for policy evaluation, appraisal, etc. Right? And then we go back up earlier into the book about expert testimony and how often it's not all that listened to. And so, yeah, man, You got to be careful, right? If you come to an agreement, but then nobody really gives a shit, nobody wants to implement it, right? Because you didn't do your homework with policymakers, then the whole endeavor was for naught, really, right? Okay. The final section, section 26.5, evaluating negotiations and mediations in the public sector. Um, this is basically just about, how do we look at whether this worked? We can look at the substantive, did we improve social outcomes? We can look at the process, right? Did we save time or resources through this setting rather than using congressional meetings or whatever it might be. And then third, relational, did we build empathy between groups? Did we help to build some common understanding of a problem, etc.? All right, this was a big one, but I think it was a really important one because a lot of you want to go this route. And so understanding argumentation, negotiation can be very powerful, especially in like law school and NGOs and stuff. So, all right, thank you so much for being here. I'll get the next one up soon. Have a great day.